Hello, good evening. It's such a pleasure and an honor to be here on behalf of the International Music Arts and Society. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be following in the footsteps of such great luminaries of the cultural world, many of whom, like me, have had reason to call Bangalore a home over the decades. I'm especially delighted to be addressing an audience of art connoisseurs, art enthusiasts, many of whom are also immigrants to this great crossroads of empires. Please allow me, over the course of the next hour or so, to tell you about people who lived 1,000 years ago in this very same place, but had much more in common with us than we might imagine. So, where do we begin with talking about Bengaluru? I'd like to start by outlining simply the remarkable geographic position that this part of South Karnataka has in relation to other parts of the subcontinent. If you were to look at maps, of which there'll be plenty in this presentation, I assure you, you will see that the Deccan Plateau looms over both coasts of India, both the east coast and the west coast. And as a result, quite naturally, trade on both coasts has been conducted partially through this plateau. Some of the earliest relics of this remarkable connectivity come from Roman coins that were discovered, I believe, in the 1890s when the Yashwantpur railway station was being constructed. Caches of Roman coins were found, confirming that specifically the Bengaluru region lay astride trade routes that must have connected both the east and west coast. But with all that said, the actual substance of this lecture, architecture, I'm going to begin by looking far away from Bengaluru, all the way in the northern part of Karnataka. Now, given that the audience today probably has a wide degree of familiarity with architecture, I'm going to try and keep the terminology to an absolute minimum. You will always find on each slide there'll be a little label indicating the region that we're looking at, as well as the rough time period. And please follow my pointer as I indicate particular architectural details for you to admire. So this temple is known as the Upper Shivalaya. It was constructed around the 7th century CE in the Upper Deccan, specifically in Badami in North Karnataka. And what's very interesting about this temple is it's one of the earliest known structurally freestanding temples in all of southern India. But there's another set of features I'd like to particularly direct your attention towards, and that is you'll notice that this overall structure of the temple itself is actually decorated with miniature temples. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to look at these moldings which stretch across the temple, you will see that there are actually miniature temples depicted on it, right? So you can see there's these very simple pilasters, which are essentially pillar-shaped forms, and these pilasters hold up these little, very shallowly carved representations of miniature temples. And this is happening not just on the main superstructure of the temple, but also on the walls of the temple itself. So in a way, this temple is architecture decorated with architecture, but the smaller elements are not very clearly detailed. They kind of blend into the overall structure of the temple itself. Now, with that in mind, let's look at a couple more temples. This is the Maligeti Shivalaya, as it's called, the Jinalaya actually, which is at Aivole, about a few kilometers from Badami. So also built by the same dynasty, the early Western Chalukyas as they're called. And here you can see in a little more detail what I'm talking about, in that the walls seem to have, you can see there's essentially a miniature altar. The altar is framed by pilasters, and the pilasters are capped by a roof. In between these little temples, we have perforated screens, and you'll also notice that these walls aren't flat, they have these projections that are gradually coming out of the surface of the wall. So what this gives the temple is this feeling of dynamism. The wall is not simply flat, it is in a very gentle sort of motion. Now, you can see this even more clearly in this slightly later temple. It's called the Sangameshwara temple at Pattadakal, once again a few kilometers from Badami. And here you will see that this idea of decorating the temple with smaller temples is starting to gather some momentum. You can see much more clearly now and much more in a much more ornate fashion that you have these beautiful miniature temples, highly detailed. Now every architectural element stands out clearly, and also see that there's a gradual layering of the architectural elements that's happening. Now, what do I mean by that? If you were to look at this element, you see this little barrel vaulted roof form here. Now, essentially, what it looks like is, imagine this as a shape, right? Something like this. Now, if you were to look at this shape, which is curved at the ends, this shape, if you were to look at it from this side, what would you see? You would just see a semicircle, right? And you can see that's exactly what's happening here, in that you have one of these barrel shaped forms, and embedded into it is the same form but rotated on its axis, right? So there's a gradual addition of elements, there's a little bit of playing with the elements that's happening. And more generally speaking, the way we can think about it is that this temple is symmetric along many axes. That's the governing logic. So you can see here we have a dome shaped form, a barrel shaped form, and a dome shaped form. Here you have a dome shaped form, a rotated barrel shaped form, barrel shaped form, rotated barrel shaped form, barrel shaped form, rotated barrel shaped form, and once again a dome shaped form. So it's a steady rhythm that is accumulating into the walls of the temple. And you can also see the projections are much more clearly defined. There are large, beautiful sculptures framed by pilasters on the walls, and in between them are these very large perforated screens that allow light to enter into the sanctum of the temple. Now, all of this is happening in North Karnataka. Now let's come to a place that all of us are much more familiar with, and that is the Bengaluru region. Now you'll see simply by looking at the geography what I was talking about earlier, in that here you have the great plateau of the Deccan, here you have this ring of hills, and here of course you have the east coast of India. Now in the period that we're looking at, which is about the 8th, 9th century CE, the Pallava dynasty ruled here in Tamil Nadu. But the Bangalore region itself, even though we're accustomed to thinking of the history of Karnataka in terms of unitary empires, the Bangalore region itself was on the frontier of two Karnataka based kingdoms. Now, the first of them was the Nolamba kingdom over here, and the other was the Ganga kingdom over here. And to give you a sense of where these are in relation to Bangalore today, this here is Nandi Hills. So Nandi Hills is quite literally the frontier between two kingdoms. This here, Manne, is a little north of Bangalore. This here, Talakad, is a little to the east of Mysore. So this is Mysore. And you can see that, so this was the seat of the Ganga kingdom here, Talakad. So to the Gangas as well, what's happening here in Bangalore is a matter of great interest, is their frontier. Bangalore itself was ruled over by a relatively minor but still significant dynasty known variously as the Nagataras and also as the Banas. Now, what was the landscape of this region like? Now, even though it was cooler than its surroundings, the region was fairly arid. So a lot of activity was concentrated around lakes or tanks, whether man-made or natural. This image that you see is from one of these natural water bodies, which is the Great Lake of Shravanabelagola, which is a couple of hours, I think, northwest of Bangalore. And Shravanabelagola, like so many other sites in South Karnataka in the 9th and 10th centuries, is actually a Jain site. So if you were to visit Bangalore a little more than 1,000 years ago, you'd see a land that was very substantially Jain. You'd see quite a lot of Jain shrines. You'd see small villages, very often going to war against each other for control over water resources, for access to cattle. And ruling over these small villages would be petty kings, ruling over whom were bigger kings like the Gangas and the Nolambas. Now, we actually know a few of these individuals who lived in Bangalore at the time. This hero stone that you see, a memorial stone that was raised at the death of a hero, is called the Kittaya hero stone. You can actually see it in Hebbal if you were to go there today. And you'll see that this hero stone actually has a depiction of this man Kittaya dying in battle. Here he is raising a dagger and trying to fire his bow. And here is a cavalryman advancing towards him holding a javelin. And you can see poor Kittaya has already been pierced by a few javelins, so he didn't actually survive this encounter. But this inscription tells us some interesting things. It tells us that when Sri Purusha Maharaja was ruling the earth, so Sri Purusha was a Ganga king, a common feature that you will see across medieval inscriptions is that kings tended to be, let's say, the opposite of humble. No matter how small the kingdom, they would insist that they were rulers of the entire earth. And you can see Sri Purusha doing that here. Now, when Sri Purusha Maharaja was ruling the earth, Pel Nagattarasa was administering Perbolal Nadu 30. So, Perbolal Nadu is what Hebbal was called. It consisted of 30 villages. It was being ruled by a little king called the Nagattara, so probably the ruler of Begur. And Kittaya, who was the brother-in-law of such and such person, attained Indraloka. He went to the world of the gods in a Uralivu battle. So, a battle that was intended to destroy the town during a Rattavadi attack. So, Rattavadi refers to northern Karnataka. So, clearly, Karnataka itself was divided into many kingdoms, and one of those kingdoms had invaded the Bangalore region. Poor Kittaya died in the process, and after his death, a gentleman called Pergundi and his brother Kirgundi erected this hero stone. Now, the man for whom Kittaya was working, or the dynasty for whom he was working, were called the Banas or the Nagattaras. And this spectacular hero stone, known as the Begur hero stone, I think it's in the Bangalore Museum today, depicts, it's actually one of the largest known hero stones ever produced, and it depicts the death of a Nagattara king, a king of Begur, in battle against a Nolamba king. So, this gentleman here on the elephant is the Nolamba king Veera Mahendra. You can see sitting on his elephant. And his poor elephant has its head punctured with a whole bunch of javelins and arrows. And you can see here the hero, the Bana king, the Nagattara, charging into battle with his other cavalrymen, while all around him infantrymen fight and die. What the image that you see on your right is actually a color reconstruction, speculative of course, that I did based on this, because we know that a lot of medieval sculptures were painted. There's traces of microscopic traces of plaster and paint on many of them, and you can see that this is a much more elaborate affair than the memorial stone erected for poor Kittaya. Here the Bana king is seated in heaven, being attended by heavenly damsels for the hard work of dying in battle, and there's quite a lot of brutality in this battle scene. There's actually a dog that's carrying away somebody's head over here, and you can see the same carving over here. There's a whole bunch of people being punctured in rather sensitive places, let's just say, people who've been absolutely destroyed by cavalry charges. You can see this man's head and his bottom are actually facing different directions, and that's actually how he's depicted in the carving as well. So this is a time where it was very important for local politicians to display their prowess on the battlefield, to die on the field of battle, to be victorious in battle and to defeat your enemies, to capture their loot, and to invest that into structures that displayed your closeness to the gods. That was how the political culture of this region in this period looked like. So with this in mind, we remember that we were talking about how Bangalore is a frontier between the Ganga and the Nolamba kingdoms, and you can see that both these kingdoms invested in erecting very, very structurally impressive temples in the Bangalore region. So the temple on the left of your screen is the Bhoga Nandishwara temple at the foot of Nandi Hills. This is the Begur temple in southern Bangalore. You can just go to it tomorrow if you'd like. It's 1100-year-old temple just sitting there in the middle of urban Bangalore. Now, what I'd like to point out to you is that even though these temples are barely 50 kilometers away from each other, they have completely different architectural ideas at play. Now, we had talked quite extensively earlier about this idea of decorating temples with temples, this idea of projections and recesses imparting a sense of dynamism to the temple. And you can see that the broad idea is shared. That general North Deccan idea is here, but is being interpreted in a completely different way. Now, in the Nolamba case, you have plenty of projections along the walls. There's a great sense of dynamism. The walls are decorated without any sculptural ornament. It's just very simple pilasters. And there's also this distinctive feature called a split colonnette. So you can imagine these are actually two halves of one single column that seem to be separated. That's the sculptor's idea. But you also see that the upper superstructure of this temple is extremely ornate. It's covered in sculptural figures, which was not the case in earlier North Deccan temples. This seems to be an idea that the Nolambas picked up from the Tamil plain. Keep in mind that they are actually neighboring the Tamil plain. So clearly, they're already integrated into wide regional circuits of ideas being exchanged, of architects moving around. Now, if you look at the Ganga temple on your right, you'll see once again we have the same idea of projections and recesses to give the wall dynamism. You have the same idea of decorating the wall with architecture, but now the architectural ornament has come to the fore. It doesn't really have that much sculptural decoration. And quite interestingly, this temple has a few figures who have been interpreted as Jain ascetics. So this may originally have been a Jain temple that was later converted to a Shiva temple. This is also a Ganga temple in Manne. So Manne is a little north of Bangalore. It's an industrial district today. A friend of mine and I went around searching for quite a while, and we found this what must once have been a spectacular temple, just hanging out there in the middle of a pile of rubble next to a bus stop that's spanking new. But unfortunately, the temple itself is in very, very poor condition. You can see it's lost most of its sculptures, most of its wall, and the entirety of its roof, and is really crying out for attention, if you ask me. Now, I don't want to give you the impression that the medieval world was only about kings and temples and warfare. So let me tell you a little bit about another story of tragedy belonging to a gentleman called Uyamma. So Uyamma was a Tamil merchant who lived around the, if I recall correctly, the late 9th, early 10th century. And Uyamma had adventured up from the Tamil plain into this part of Karnataka. I think this is in Hegganadevanakkote Taluk, which is not far from Mysore. And what ended up happening to Uyamma is a local chieftain by the name of Konguni figured that this merchant was going to be an easy target. So Konguni gathers up 300 of his lads and they go over to Uyamma's rented accommodation. They tell him that, look, give us all your stuff and we'll leave you alive. Now, initially, Uyamma, according to an inscription, not the inscription on the screen, but another inscription, he tried to negotiate with Konguni. He asked for advice from another council of senior merchants on the Tamil plain, and they insisted that he fight this out to the bitter end. So Uyamma fought 300 guys. I will leave the consequences to your imagination. And his son Anamili, according to a hero stone erected in their memory, weeping that they had killed his father, also attacked the mob and was killed. Now, this was a warlike land. It was not the most, as much as it relied on trade, it could sometimes be a very unfriendly place for merchants. But this was going to change. In the late 10th century, the political equilibrium of the Indian subcontinent was completely shattered. Up till this point, the dominant powers of medieval India tended to be mighty Deccan empires that ruled over the entire plateau and used this to storm down onto the coast, to levy tribute, to imbricate themselves into international networks of trade. But in the late 10th century, all of that went to pieces. There was a massive political collapse, and into the political vacuum expanded a new dynasty from the east coast, the Chola Empire. And as they arrived in this region, the Cholas did something very interesting. They renamed this region, which used to be called Gangavadi, the Ganga capital, the Ganga country, and Nolambavadi, or the Nolamba country. And they renamed both of these older political units into Mudikonda Chola Mandalam, and Nigarli Chola Mandalam, which means the circle of the crown seizing Chola and the circle of the invincible Chola. The reason why we call the Tamil coast the Coromandel coast today is because the word Coromandel comes from Chola Mandalam. Chola Mandalam is a name that the Cholas applied not just to their own homeland, but also with a few embellishments to conquered territories in a bid to absorb their earlier histories into this new trans-regional empire that extended across a huge chunk of India's east coast and for the first time integrated a chunk of the Deccan and reoriented it towards the coast. Now, what does this lead to architecturally? The temple that you see in your top left is the Bhoganandishwara temple that we just saw a few slides ago. This is the temple at Begur on the top right. And this is an unnamed temple that I found during fieldwork for my Chola book at Manne, the former Ganga capital. And you'll immediately see that there's something very different happening with this temple. Keep in mind the basic elements of Deccan temple construction, the recessing of the walls and the decoration of the temple with mini temples. Neither of that is happening here. This instead is a completely flat wall. There's no projections. Just to remind you what the projections look like, this is how they look like. There's a very clear module that sticks out of the wall of the temple. There's a module that goes inside, comes out, goes inside, comes out. That is not what we're seeing here. We are seeing that once again the split colonnette, which is a defining element of Tamil architecture, has suddenly appeared now in the southern Deccan, really in the Bangalore region. And this applies to other temples near Bangalore as well. If I could have a quick show of hands, how many here in the audience have been to Kolar? To Kolar? Very nice, very nice. That's a good number. So as all of you would know, Kolar is home to the Kolarama temple. How many of you knew that the Kolarama temple as it stands is a Chola structure? This wall that you see is covered in Tamil inscriptions. And these inscriptions tell us that the Kolarama temple was actually crucial to political struggles that played out in the Chola court in the 11th century. I won't get into that in too much detail. I hope you'll buy the book to find out more. Now, we can see the consequences of the Chola invasion of this part of South Karnataka, not just in the architecture, but also in the inscriptions. Now, you will see that the lighter orange is Kannada inscriptions. The darker orange refers to Tamil inscriptions. This is the number of inscriptions every year. And you can see that pretty much up till the early 11th century, all inscriptions in the Bangalore region were made in Kannada. And my thanks to the Inscription Stores of Bengaluru project for helping me with this data. There's a sudden change that happens right around the turn of the 11th century, immediately after Rajaraja Chola, the great conqueror, invades South Karnataka. Suddenly, there is a massive spike in the proportion of Tamil inscriptions that are being produced in this region. But the use of Kannada does not die out. And so we have, from 1,000 years ago, what we can indubitably say on the basis of multiple lines of evidence is cosmopolitanism. Here are immigrants who are integrating themselves into an existing society. The immigrants that came from the Chola country weren't just conquerors, they also included merchants. And this is why I was talking about the unfortunate Tamil merchant Uyama a little while ago, is because in the 11th century, alongside the Chola armies came a massive Tamil merchant corporation who set up shop in Talakkad, the old Ganga capital. So the temple that you see, once again, left side of your screen, is the Begur temple. This temple on the right is the temple at Mudigundam, which is a little distance away from Talakkad. It's on the southern bank of the Kaveri. And this temple was built by Tamil merchants. So we know this because of inscriptions, but also very simply because of the architecture. Here, very clearly, is a temple that completely lacks the recesses and projections, the dynamism that you'd expect in a Ganga-style temple. but it does still feature the same very squat kind of superstructure that Ganga temples have, clearly because Ganga architects and sculptors were probably used in the construction of this structure. Now, we've talked a little bit about what's happening in this part of South Karnataka, but we began this lecture in North Karnataka. And to understand the next phase in the evolution of this region's temples, we need to return to the northern Deccan, which is ruled by the later Chalukya Empire. Now, I'd like to point out a few things to you about where these later Chalukyas are. While they do have some presence here in North Karnataka, so these thick lines indicate political boundaries and these thinner lines indicate linguistic boundaries, you can automatically see that here this blue line is the Kannada zone, this purple line is the Tamil zone. The Chola Empire by definition is trans-regional, multi-ethnic because it is part of multiple linguistic zones. But similarly, the later Chalukya kingdom also is partially in the Marathi zone, partially in the Kannada zone, and also has political connections and interests in central India. Now, what were the Chalukyas doing with their architecture? What I find continually fascinating about Deccan architecture is this seemingly endless ability for innovation. And you can see, looking at this diagram by the great architectural historian Adam Hardy, that we began this lecture really by looking at very simple temples, right? All they had is a simple square-shaped floor plan, but we saw how it began to become more and more elaborate, how the tower became taller. We saw how the wall began to be consisted of slight projections, recesses. And now what begins to happen by the late 10th, early 11th century is that architects seem to feel that simply using projections and recesses isn't enough. You can't decorate the temple enough. You can't exhibit your architectural virtuosity enough. So what they begin to do, and here, follow me very closely, is they take the simple square and they project a smaller square out of its center. Okay? Once you've done that, what's the logical next step? You have a square projecting from a square. So why not make a square projecting from a square, projecting from a square, projecting from a square, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. As you can imagine, very quickly this gets out of hand. You have so many projections to be decorated that the temple's walls, its shape seems to dissolve into these endless faces. And so what do? Clearly, squares coming out of squares has reached its logical conclusion. Now, let's take a square and let's rotate it on its own axis and get a star shape. Now, let's look at a few temples to illustrate and understand how this actually happened. This is the Jodi Kalasha temple, as it's called, in North Karnataka, in Sudi. My thanks to the Deccan Heritage Foundation for sharing this image with me from the archives and a few other images as well. And you'll see that here in the Jodu Kalasha, you have on the left side, square projecting from a square, another square projecting from it, and all of these faces no longer have enough room for you to have these impressive sculptures. So you get into the sculptures and you focus only on small architectural modules, miniature temples. And so you have this extremely complex looking facade that's actually simply the same element. If you look at this barrel vaulted element layered upon itself 3 or 4 times to give you this sense of projection, of emanation. And you can already see here in the same temple that architects are beginning to experiment with this interesting idea of having the faces of the square meet themselves, thus creating a vertice which you can decorate on 2 sides with miniature temples positioned on pilasters. To give you a further sense of the architectural inventiveness of the workshop of architects at Sudi, This is a stepwell that they constructed, that was actually commissioned by the general who constructed the earlier temple. And here you can see that what the architects have done is they've tried to make the interior of the stepwell look like the exterior of a temple. So once again, you have the same projections, the same layering of elements that you see here. The staggered square, instead of projecting outwards, is now projecting inwards. The Deccan Heritage Foundation is actually restoring this spectacular structure with the generous support of the Pinnamaneni family. And I, for one, cannot wait to see what they manage to do once this temple is fully restored to its former glory. Now, we've talked enough about projections. Behold the stellate, the star-shaped plan. This is the Dodda Basappa temple at Hangal, and you can see this spectacular logical conclusion of squares rotated on squares to give you a 24-pointed star with these beautifully detailed miniature temples ascending all the way up to the tier. Every facet of this star decorated with miniature temples, a great profusion of sculptural ornament, all helped by a bunch of social changes that were happening in North Karnataka, which is beyond the scope of this lecture. But what I'd particularly like to emphasize is A, the star-shaped plan, and also the development of these pillar forms in the hall, where you can see the pillar is rendered as this almost stack-like structure with these rounded elements, rectangular elements, and miniature temples and sculptures studding all of them. Now, the reason I talk about the Chalukyas and the reason I chose these two temples in particular to discuss is because the Chalukyas were at war with the Cholas. Now, that seems like a fairly banal statement to make, but I'd like you to really think about how medieval warfare may have worked. Today, when we think about wars, when we think about battles, we tend to think of kings waving their swords and armies jumping out of the earth to execute their orders, teleporting to the battlefield, running at each other across a battlefield, fighting for 10-15 minutes, and then the war is over. That's not how medieval warfare worked. Medieval warfare depended on logistics. It depended on manpower. Keep in mind that medieval societies didn't have an abundance of food like we do today. Every man who is on the battlefield is a man who is not at home tending the harvest, cultivating the crops. And so if you have sustained warfare between two vast trans-regional multilingual imperial powers, both these powers had to figure out some way to get manpower to the battlefields and to keep them there. Now, the Chalukya solution to this is essentially to outsource the business of war to a great extent to these local aristocratic families who become very wealthy through war and then build temples like the ones that we've seen. But they also rely on new peoples who are now entering the political arena. Because the Cholas had conquered the old Gangavadi region, this entire area around Bangalore briefly was in a bit of political anarchy. It was torn between local chieftains and Chola kings, and into the anarchy emerged a very interesting group of people. A people who come down from the Western Ghats, whose earliest kings called themselves Malaprol Ganda, the man among the hill chiefs. And those people were the Hoysalas. This sculpture depicts the legendary founder of the Hoysalas, a boy supposedly called Sala, who was in the forest one day learning martial arts from his guru when a tiger or a lion or a yali pounced on the guru. Sala immediately advanced to protect his teacher. The guru yelled out, "Poi Sala," which means hit Sala. And with a single blow, this hero is supposed to have killed the lion. Now, of course, I don't think that's what actually happened. But the fact is that Sala and his descendants wanted to be remembered as such. They did not want to be remembered merely as these people who came from the Western Ghats, but rather as people who were divinely favored, who were divinely powerful. And they had quite an eclectic career working for the Chalukyas of the northern Deccan. They fought on behalf of the Chalukyas against the Cholas, they attacked various Chola trade routes, and they also were deployed as mercenaries working for the Chalukyas in central India, in Madhya Pradesh. And these campaigns are so successful that within 2 generations, these descendants of hunter-gatherers from the Western Ghats had embarked on the construction of this colossal imperial temple. This here is the Vijayanagara or the Chennakeshava temple at Belur. And you can see that the Hoysalas, what they're doing, even though keep in mind they're ruling over Gangavadi, they claim the title of Vikrama Ganga, the heroic Ganga. They're trying to legitimize themselves by presenting themselves as following in the traditions of the old Ganga kings. But the temple that they are building has nothing in common with a Ganga temple. Keep in mind that Ganga temples had these rhythmic projections. The basic idea of the floor plan was a square. They had very squat towers. But we know from archival photographs that the Chennakeshava temple had a colossal curvilinear brick tower on top of it. Now, what did this brick tower look like? Well, it looked something like this, where you can see there's a central spine, and around the central spine are much smaller temples which are stacked in tiers. This is a distinctively North Deccan, Maharashtrian, Central Indian Malwan style, which the Hoysalas must have picked up during their mercenary careers in Central India. And when they are building this temple, they built this in 1117 after driving the Cholas out of Gangavadi, when they were on the verge of declaring themselves independent from the Chalukyas. And very clearly, they want to build an imperial temple that integrates ideas from this vast network of circulation that Bangalore is now connected to. This temple on your screen is the Gondeshwara temple at Sinnar. This is in Maharashtra. It was built by a contemporary dynasty of the Hoysalas called the Yadavas. And here you can see exactly what I'm talking about. This curvilinear brick tower with a central spine and temples arranged on it in tiers. Very clearly, now you can see the connection. But what I find really interesting about the Hoysalas is that though today they're thought of as a Kannada power, just as the Cholas are thought of as a Tamil power, just as the Cholas had a substantial presence in Tamil Nadu, the Hoysalas just as the Cholas had a substantial presence in Gangavadi, in the Kannada-speaking areas, the Hoysalas had a very substantial presence in the Kaveri Valley, in the Tamil-speaking areas, specifically in the area around Srirangam. Here, you might notice that there's something a little wacky about this map. This is the kind of map that you can expect to see in my new history of the Chola Empire. And the idea really is to give you a sense of what these medieval polities actually looked like. They were not unitary states. The degree of control that royal families had varied quite extensively. And so depending on the territory, depending on the audience that they want that is going to be inside their temple, they vary the architectural style. So while they are building this spectacular star-shaped temple in Karnataka with ideas from central India, clearly to speak to the Chalukyas, here in Srirangam, in the 12th century, they are building a very different kind of temple. It's much more Tamil style. You can see that it's got, once again, the split colonnettes, but it has moved a little away from the Tamil style with these clearly defined projections, this very large plinth, and on the plinth, miniature temples, just like there is in their great imperial temple at Belur. So clearly you have an architectural concept that evolves in the Deccan with ideas from central India now being translated into Tamil architectural concepts. Simply by understanding the visual vocabulary of these temples, we're able to see movements and migrations and intentions on behalf of the builders and the patrons that commissioned them. This marvelous, absolutely marvelous hall, this pillared hall, is once again within the Bhoganandishwara temple at the foothills of Nandi. And it's very possibly a Hoysala period addition. When the Hoysalas arrive in this region, they make this addition to the Bhoganandishwara. And you're going to see a bit of a recurring pattern here. This, of course, is the logical conclusion of the spectacular Hoysala style. This is the temple at Somnathapura near Mysore. And here you can see what's actually a double altered temple, both with spectacular stellate forms, absolutely covered with a profusion of architectural and sculptural elements. Now, by the late 13th century, things began to change once again in medieval politics, as they always do. The Hoysalas were gradually driven out from the Tamil country, and we begin to see a new but very fragile political equilibrium in the Deccan region and beyond, where now you have, instead of trans-regional empires, more regionally consolidated kingdoms that are confined to individual linguistic zones. It's really from this point of time that we can begin to talk about Kannada speaking polities, or Marathi speaking polities, or Tamil or Telugu speaking polities. But I won't waste your time with that. I am more interested in the century right after the 13th, when the Delhi Sultanate swept into South India, shattered the political equilibrium, and allowed for the emergence of a new South Indian polity, the Vijayanagara Empire. Now, to understand the history of South Karnataka so far, we have looked at examples of North Karnataka's temple architecture. But to understand Vijayanagara, I'd like to take you further south to the Tamil region. This is the Airavateshwara temple at Dharasuram, not far from Kumbakonam. I'm guessing a few of you may have been there. And here I'd like to point out to you one of the last great imperial Chola temples, which has these little shrines with split colonnettes. And these shrines are separated from each other by these little half pots. You can see these pots here. And from the pots emerge these little pilasters. Right? Now, these features I'd like you to keep an eye on. Now, if I were to go around to the other side of this temple, to the main hall, I would find on the edges of the main hall these beautiful little pillars carved with little creatures called yalis, which have the heads of elephants and the bottoms, I must say, very, very well-shaped bottoms of lions. Now, the reason I bring this up is because I want to show you some features of Tamil architecture and then take you to a temple once again in Bangalore to show you some distinctly Tamil-looking ideas that seem to be appearing. Now, this here is the Gopuram, the bottom of the gateway of the Bhoganandishwara temple. This gateway was added by Vijayanagara in the 16th century. And oddly enough, Vijayanagara, though it's an empire based in Karnataka, has built a Gopuram that has split colonnettes and that has these little pots with pilasters coming out of them. A very Tamil architectural idea. And you'll also see in this little hall that they've built adjacent to the entrance, you have these rearing creatures, yalis once again, with the heads of elephants and the bodies of lions positioned on the outer register of pillars. So why is Vijayanagara building in this completely different architectural style? Well, the answer is that we don't really know. We think that when Vijayanagara armies entered the Tamil country, they found these extremely impressive, looming, imposing Chola imperial structures and decided that they wanted to play with those elements to create a new kind of imperial temple vocabulary. But the really interesting thing is that even after the disappearance of Vijayanagara, now it kind of makes sense why Vijayanagara would do this, right? They rule over Karnataka, over Kannada speakers. They rule over Tamil speakers, they rule over Telugu speakers. They want a temple that can be understood as belonging to all these constituencies. But after the fall of Vijayanagara, when the famous Kempegowda established the city of Bangalore as we know it, we still have Tamil architectural ideas in Bangalore's temples. This Gopuram belongs to the Someshwara temple at Alsur, very close to where I used to live. And I used to walk down from my place in Alsur to the Takshila institution where I used to work. Every morning, I'd walk through this beautiful winding little lane, which had a church, I believe, from 1911. So older than the First World War that was constructed in. I was very impressed. I thought that was the oldest structure in that area. One fine day on the way to the office, through a gully, a gap in two buildings, I happened to see this side of the Someshwara temple, and it stopped me dead in my tracks. As I went closer, I realized here you have a Vijayanagara period or a post Vijayanagara provincial style that very clearly has little pots with projecting pilasters, the split colonnettes, exactly like the imperial Chola style that was developed by Vijayanagara. So clearly, there's something else happening here. These immigrants who have settled down in Karnataka, whether in the Chola period or in the Vijayanagara period, their idea of what a temple should look like has transformed. No longer is it the Hoysala star-shaped idiom. Now it is the Vijayanagara imperial style that is being depicted here. And the really interesting thing about these Gauda chieftains of Bangalore is that they, while remaining within the broader Vijayanagara tradition, also introduce their own innovations. So one really remarkable thing they do, and keep in mind, all the temples we've seen so far have sculptures placed within frames, yes, within these little mini altars. At the Someshwara temple in Alsur, these frames have been completely disposed of. Suddenly, the temple itself has transformed into a narrative canvas. Depicted here is the marriage of Shiva and Parvati. And you can see in this Gauda period addition to the Bhoganandishwara temple, once again, frames are dispensed with and the sculptures are wrenched out. The narrative wraps around the entire structure. So innovations are still continuing here in Namma Bengaluru. So I'd like to bring you all to the end of this presentation with pretty much where my journey into the history of Bangalore began, with a photo of the Someshwara temple that I took just a couple of months ago. It amazes me, really. If you were to go deeper into the Someshwara temple, you'll see there are elements that seem to belong to the Chola period around 1,000 years ago. And I just showed you additions made by the Gaudas in the 1700s, as well as this Gopuram that dates to the 1700s, but continues to be restored, modified, kept alive. Within the courtyard of this temple are shrines that date to a few years ago that I saw being constructed. And in so many ways, I really believe that the Someshwara temple exemplifies the history of this remarkable crossroads, in that every people, every polity that have come here seem to have added something to the mix. They have added a little layer to the city, a little bit of a new puzzle piece added into this ever-expanding mosaic, this mosaic of which both you and I are just a tiny and fleeting part. Thank you so much. You've been a great audience.
Anirudh, thank you so much. We learned about these incredible cross-pollinations of architectural elements and walked through our own city and its region with new eyes. So I hope when I visit the temple at Alsur, I will be able to remember the architectural elements that I should. But if not, of course, I'll have the book, which all of you can also get outside. Wanted to ask you a couple of questions about this whole project of research and how much of it was field work and actually going to the temples, and how much of it was following archival documentation and other scholarship.
Indra, I find that as many times as you look at a photo or an elevation drawing, nothing really compares to the experience of being in a temple itself. And while researching my Chola book, I especially made a point of looking at Tamil style temples in South Karnataka, because I think that all the evidence points us very firmly in the direction of these medieval polities being much more dynamic and diverse than we generally assume. Um, a really interesting trend I noticed in the Bangalore region is that even though the Hoysalas are thought of as a Kannada power, after they reconquer the region from the Cholas, they still continue to use Tamil. So quite a lot of the early inscriptions of Bangalore are actually in Tamil. If you were to go to the Chokanatha temple at Damlur, really not very far from here, there are 13th and 14th century Tamil inscriptions made by a local military officer who's living here and who seems to have been a local Bangalorean, but using Chola titles to present himself, using Chola imperial language to present his gift to the god. So it's important to look at multiple lines of evidence when reconstructing patterns like this. Art history and epigraphy are very important, and I'm hoping that this generates more archaeological interest in these structures as well. Um, I really hope that as the Bangalore metro is being expanded, just as the Rome metro is being expanded, you kept running into these spectacular Roman palaces. Maybe there's something very interesting lying under our very feet that is still waiting to be discovered.
Yes, what an exciting thought.
Very nice talk. Very enjoyed it very much. Just a question: the Mysore, the Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, the architectures look somewhat similar. And has there been do people ever like talk or compare this with like Western style architecture or Western architects who've done things in India like in Chandigarh or places like that? Is there any like people to ever compare this?
So it's not my period of expertise, sir, but yes, Mysore, especially in the 19th century, saw some remarkable innovations happening architecturally. In fact, the Deccan Heritage Foundation is working on the restoration of the Jai Mahal Vilas Palace, which belonged to the royal family. And we are constantly discovering new things about the architects and the ideas that were in circulation. What amazes me is that there is never really a contraction of the influences in South Karnataka's architecture. There's this constant expansion, more and more circulation, wider and wider networks of patronage and migration are contributing to the architecture of the region. So, thank you. That's a great question.
The addition to these temples in continuum by the Maharajas of Mysore, you can see the evidence of that in Devarayana Durga, which is not far off from here, where the Krishna Devaraya or earlier kings renovated those temples which were supposed to be from the Hoysala tradition and added elements to that which brought their own Mysore tradition.
Absolutely, sir. In fact, I believe the Bhogan Nandishwara temple itself has this spectacular mandapa, this pillared hall that was added to the original Nolangba period structure, where the Vijayanagara architects clearly studied Nolamba architecture, even though the tradition was extinct then, and tried to copy and reinterpret the elements. And a stepwell that was added and then embellished under the Mysore Maharajas actually features the Mysore style multi-cusped Devakoshtas, which were made with plaster, which is something that Mysorean artists had tremendous facility with. So yes, it is really amazing to see, and the Someshwara temple is by no means an exception. All the medieval temples of Bangalore have continued to evolve pretty much in a straight line all the way up to the present day and are still evolving.
Anirudh, it's always a great pleasure to hear you,
Thank you, Master.
talk. I'll never get tired of your lectures. I wanted to ask you, in the first slide you had put up before you started your lecture, the last words in that slide are Sri Virupaksha,
Yes.
right? And it's the same in Telugu and Kannada. So,
Yes.
now my question is, why are all the other alphabets so different? All the other scripts seem totally disconnected with this. How did that happen?
Well, this inscription, I believe, was actually chosen by the BIC team, but a very interesting choice of inscription. The primary language of the inscription is Tamil. So I'm not sure exactly what the provenance of this inscription is, but I'm guessing it might be it could be either from the Bangalore region or perhaps even from the Tamil region. But the fact that Virupaksha is signed in this Telugu Kanda script is very interesting because Virupaksha is a very Deccan god. He is the royal god of Vijayanagara, and clearly, even though the administrative work of this inscription is being done in Tamil, so clearly there's this local Tamil headmen or farmers who are intended to read this inscription, the signature of the god itself is in the Vijayanagara courtly language, which is courtly Telugu.
Actually, since I don't see that there's another question, I'm going to slip in another one, or rather a comment. You know, one of the things that you often hear about Western painters, Rembrandt and so on, is that there are periods when they're very monochrome or more still in their depiction of whatever they're doing. And that was often an economic choice because paints were so expensive, lapis was hard to come by, and so on. So when you first showed the picture, the slide of the temple built by the merchant with the whitewashed wall, I forget precisely where, Mani was it? I'm not sure.
Mudigonda.
Modi. I thought to myself, maybe it was an economic reason that it was the flat walls and not the stellated. But then I see if he was a rich merchant, that may not have been the case. Yeah.
Yes. And we do have examples of Deccan temples commissioned by less wealthy patrons. And while they reduce the quality of the carvings, the basic idea of the staggered square, the rhythmic wall still remains even with a lower budget. So clearly, if the patron is choosing to have a completely flat wall, it is a deliberate choice. And especially given that we have the inscription in Tamil, I think that gives us a pretty clear idea of why it was built in this particular way.
Yes.
Hi, Anirudh.
Hello.
Big fan of both your books. Absolutely, just like love them.
Thank you.
So my question is, do these temples ever talk about like some superstar designer or an architect or like the creative credits behind the temples?
So it's vanishingly rare, but it does happen. So one of the temples at Pattadakal, we know was designed by an architect called Gundan, who was supposedly the foremost of all the architects in the southern land. Very humble people, these medieval folks, let me tell you. And Gundan, this is a very interesting line in the inscription which suggests that the queen who commissioned that temple, Loka Mahadevi, saved Gundan and his guild from being excommunicated from caste because of his remarkable services in building the temple. And this makes me think there may have been some scandal in the court or something that this gentleman or somebody under him ended up in. And I mean, if the outcome was that spectacular temple, then I'm happy that that scandal happened. There's also a few other examples, especially in Hoysala temples. While we don't know the overall architects, we have the names of individual sculptors. So the famous Madanikas, these beautiful women who are positioned on the eaves of the Hoysala temples, we know the names of particular sculptors and the titles that they were given by the Hoysala king, but we can also see their names carved on other sculptures in other parts of Karnataka. So it's possible to build a chronology of where these guys came from and how they moved around. And we know some of their names. There's an interesting chap called Dasoja. One of his pieces is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Like, what a place for your work to end up in. And we know of a few other artists, and they had the most absurd titles. One of them was called the Thunderbolt to the Hill, that is the rival sculptors. And this was clearly a title given to them by the Hoysala king. So the scholarly consensus is that it seems the Hoysalas are going out of their way to invite sculptors from other parts of Karnataka, other parts of southern India, and allowed them to not just retain their identity, their ownership of their sculptures, but also to compete for titles and honor. And it must have been and really what we see is this great outpouring of sculpture in the Hoysala period. So there's all these things that are lying just beneath the surface. Once you understand how to look at these temples, break down the elements, follow patterns, you will never look at them the same way again. And I think it's a real tragedy that we think of them purely as religious or purely as political or purely as devotional structures, because there's so much more to them. Really, temples are the tip of the iceberg of this fascinating medieval society that was so different from ours, but also in many ways very similar. Because I don't know, something about the fact that medieval architects could be arrogant, I find very relatable.
Hi, Anirudh. Thank you. That was a great talk.
Thank you,
Couple
sir.
of questions. One about the banas. Okay, I'll just stick to one. In popular imagination, a lot of these temples, be it Chokanatha, Someshwara, Chola temples, from your talk, they're not necessarily Chola temples, but have retained some of the architectural elements. Can it also be true that the origin of the temple was Chola, then embellished and added on by the other dynasties, retaining some of the Chola architectural features?
Well, in some cases, yes. In the case of Someshwara temple, we think there may have been an inner Chola core that was added onto. In other places, we can be pretty sure that they belonged to other dynasties and the Cholas then came and took over. So one of the lingams in the Bengaluru temple is actually called Choleshwara, but all the hero stones, all the inscriptions around it suggest that it was one of the seats of the Bana family who spoke Kannada, used Kannada in the inscriptions. So here you very clearly have a case where the opposite has happened. But it's impossible to give you a single general rule. It really must have depended on the political value of particular temples. Where was it suitable for a king to take ownership? Where was it suitable for a king to present himself as following in an older tradition? In the Bhoganandishwara temple, for example, it's an older sacred site, and therefore no single king claims ownership. They just add new things to it. So I hope that answers the question. Thank you, sir.
Nice answer.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, Anirudh. I just wanted a clarification. Now, what you termed as constant innovation and improvisation and addition in the Deccan and this region, is that unique to this region alone, or in the North India, Eastern India also this kind of constant changes were happening with temple architecture?
So yes, sir. Constant. I think change is a constant everywhere, but which direction is the change happening in? Why is the change happening? These are important questions to ask. Now, it's very often difficult to get a peek into the minds of medieval architects, but occasionally there are hints that come through in the inscriptions. So there's a spectacular temple at Itagi, not far from Hampi, the Mahadeva temple. And the Itagi Mahadeva temple's foundation inscription tells us that the general Mahadeva who commissioned it considered it to be an emperor among temples. Now, if you look at the sculptures on the temples and keep in mind, there's a Deccan temple, right? So the temple is decorated with smaller temples. The smaller temples are in a whole bunch of different styles. So you see Odia style temples in miniature, you see North Indian style temples, the Nagara style, the Shekhari style, the Bhumija style, all represented in very, very small forms. And above them is a looping Makara Torana integrating into the overall superstructure of the Mahadeva temple. So just as a emperor is a king of kings, this temple is a temple of temples. So very clearly here you can see the intent of the architect, of the patron. Now, if you look at Tamil temples, you will instead find in some inscriptions that the architect was praised as a great architect because he rendered all of the modules perfectly. So the emphasis of the Tamil temple instead is to show its continuity with the regional architectural tradition. With the Deccan temple is to show that your temple is better than everything that came before it. So very clearly, while change is still happening, it's happening because of very, very different reasons and motivations.
So, Anirudh, nice to see you again. Do you have any comment on the construction technique development over time in this area? So, I'm guessing, for example, the Rashtrakutas, they had their own stone cut thing, and the Cholas came in with their massive, like Brihadishwara style Bhupurams and so on. So, I'm guessing there is also logistics and material innovation which is happening along with architectural innovation.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, while the earliest temples are in sandstone, this seems to be because structural stone temples begin in Badami, which has sandstone cliffs. Then this becomes a constant for a while. But in the 11th, 12th centuries, under the later Chalukyas, keep in mind what I was saying about generals emerging as the main temple patrons now. These generals obviously come from a whole bunch of different areas, don't all have access to sandstone. So there's a number of new kinds of stone that are introduced in a temple building. So you see pot stone, soapstone. And the interesting thing about these stones is that they're much softer, which allows you to make much more details, which allows you to decorate your temple with more architectural elements, and which ends up in the spectacular Hoysala temples. Now, the idea of the Chola temple is very different in that the emphasis on, rather than being detailed, it's got to be big. So the engineering approach is very different. You want to use granite, you want to use brick, and Vijayanagara picks this up. It seems to prefer this structurally imposing structure. So if you look at the Gopuram of the Someshwara temple at Alsur, very clearly the standard Chola style stone basement on top of which is a brick tower. So as for the actual construction techniques themselves, we're guessing there must have been a lot of bullock-powered cranes, especially in the imperial temple. There must have been elephant-powered cranes, which is something I would love to see. We have some guesses about stone carving techniques. We know that wedges were used, so wooden wedges were driven at regular intervals into stone. Water was poured to make the wood expand and crack the stone quite evenly. But still, so many questions that remain to be answered. We have some ideas about corbelling, how layers were developed to support the ones above them. But we don't really have a lot of insight into precisely what techniques were used. Like, what did an elephant-powered crane look like? And these are questions that only archaeology can solve. We keep digging, we'll eventually find evidence of this. We'll find pulleys, we'll find gears, hopefully. It's a wide, wide world of questions waiting to be answered, man.
Clearly, there were no maquettes made, right?
No, unfortunately.
Yes. Well, Anirudh, I mean, this has been wonderful. I know that there must be many people who want to converse with you and ask you more questions, but I think that will have to be taken outside.
Sure.
And so it falls upon me the great pleasure of saying thank you so very much for this most
Thank you all.
enlightening.
Thank you.